Greetings, and thanks for coming to this month's Salon. I'm working from a script this time because I haven't done this for a while, and unless kept in check, I may wander or ramble. I hope we'll have a lot to discuss during the main portion of the meeting, so I want to limit this intro to make sure we get as much time as possible for the rest. This is a slightly trimmed version of the 4 posts that I linked to over the past couple of weeks, so if it sounds familiar, I apologize. This month's topic is dramatic ritual. I chose this topic because, although my active magical fraternity experience is pretty dated, the majority of the work I did was in dramatic ritual, much of it public. Of all the life skills that my fraternal experience helped to strengthen and refine, I'd have to say that what I learned from dramatic ritual work of communicating intent, of persuasion, and of connecting with an audience has been the most important and useful. Those skills went a long way towards securing my success as a teacher and tutor in China from 2007 to 2014, where many of my assignments included public speaking and all included influencing others across language barriers. As Thelemites, this is an important topic for all of us because of our professed goals. We're all more or less engaged in a process of influencing the world at large to be more in accord with the basic tenets of Thelema, which we consider to be the crucial social, political, spiritual, and cosmic factor of our age. So much of our participation in this process, at least ideally, involves physically, demonstrably enacting our principles to the world. And that enactment naturally partakes of the same kind of principles found in dramatic ritual. As members of magical societies and fraternities, it's important for us to understand what happens in dramatic ritual, because so much of what we do socially among each other, not to mention the programming content of fraternal initiations, also partakes of it. The cult of Thelema, as it should be with all New Aeon cults, is different from other cults because, since it involves as among its highest ethics that of informed and freely intended will and choice, it cannot rely on any of the typical misdirection and deception necessary to the more traditional cults of the previous aeons. For this reason, it is important for Thelema's adherents to understand the manipulations they subject their minds to, and not to hide such knowledge from others. Dramatic ritual is programming, first and foremost, and so to use it responsibly and subject ourselves to it with clarity, we owe it to ourselves to educate ourselves on how it works, or at least what we're working with. As members of the greater society, it is important to understand how these principles of dramatic ritual play themselves out in social and professional exchanges, in commercial and political culture, and as the general basis for communicating and anchoring our various cultural myths. So the first concept that I put in here, the audience is an operator. So the presence of an audience is the primary factor that makes dramatic ritual different from other kinds of ritual, and which essentially determines its optimal uses. As mentioned a moment ago, group programming is a primary function of dramatic ritual, and this requires a much different mindset than other kinds of ritual, which could be said to be more focused on the individual's orientation to the cosmos or to their own personal aspirations. In a Thelemic context, this programming should be consensual and cooperative, ideally with clear goals mutually in mind throughout the group. This is much different than common theater plays, where the audience is an essentially passive element whose function is to appreciate or validate a performance. In dramatic ritual, the audience is an operator, and that makes their role active. Even if there is no audience in terms of individuals observing without having their own lines, or any visible interaction with the main officiants, each officiant themselves is still technically the audience for each of the others, as each is individually responsible for their part in producing in each of the others the necessary and suitable trances for the successful conclusion of the ritual. In order to identify and implement the most effective ways to achieve such a result, we have to know who our audience is, and presumably why they're in the ritual space. These factors will vary according to the intent of the ritual and the size of the audience. In a more public function, such as a dramatic demonstration of an organization's egregore to newcomers, the concern can be more general, as the intended effect is probably already on the surface of the material being performed. I think in OTO we use the Gnostic Mass for this, although I don't know how well suited it is to that, to tell you the truth. Back on script. In this case, the intent is probably to deepen their interest in the organization, or to give them a deeper insight into whether it's suitable for them to want to become further involved. As for why the audience members have come, motivations on this level are easy to determine as well as to manage. If they're favorably disposed to the organization or its goals, they'll be further attracted. If unfavorably, they'll be repelled. Both are favorable outcomes in terms of the ritual's intent. And if the ritual is well crafted, shouldn't require much additional engagement from the officiants beyond skillful coordination and presentation. And I'll go off script again here to say, attracting the favorably disposed and repelling the unfavorably disposed, those are both positive outcomes. If your intent is to attract everybody regardless of whether they're suitable or not, then you're not going to get good outcomes. And that isn't a good reason to perform a ritual, in my opinion. So, back to the script. In a more personalized function, such as an initiation, the primary audience is an individual who is likely already in a heightened state of consciousness. As such, officiants ideally should have a more or less thorough knowledge of the candidate's specific motives in approaching the organization or in pursuing advancement, as achievement of the specific trance necessary for the candidate to favorably engage with the material being presented is heavily dependent on those motives being properly and skillfully managed. Traditionally, initiation rituals are written to assume that all candidates have more or less uniform motives, and likely hinge on a general belief that people are fairly simple and interchangeable, and that comparably simple, interchangeable pre-indoctrination tactics within society and the temple community are more than sufficient to mold the candidate into a more or less proper mindset before entering the temple. In a postmodern world and within a thelemic context, it's not reasonable or desirable to take such imagined factors for granted. So as initiators and as officers in initiations, it would really be ideal if we knew our candidate, if we knew why they wanted to be in the organization, and if we knew what kind of member they're likely to become if they're in the organization. In a complex operation, such as a theatrical performance requiring a protracted rehearsal schedule, substantial creative and material support, dedication to seeing the project through on a volunteer basis, and the likely presence of an audience with whom one wants to share and maintain the trance being produced, a very high degree of attunement to the state and needs of the cast, crew, and audience is necessary. This attunement ideally is not the sole province of the director or producer, but something equally shared among all involved. A large volunteer production with many cast members, substantial material needs, and 2 to 3 rehearsals per week for 2 to 3 months requires no small amount of dedication from every individual involved. Understanding the source of this dedication for each participant, including identifying at the earliest stages whether any sources of dedication are healthy, suitable, or likely to hold out until the end, is crucial to the success of volunteer productions on this scale. If you have somebody who is going to bail on the production a week before the performance, that's a really bad scene. Fortunately, that's never happened to me, but it has almost happened, and it creates a lot of stress. In addition to knowing that all of one's co-participants have what it takes to stay in until the end, one must also be certain that they have an effective orientation toward their part and can effectively embody whatever that part exemplifies. Finally, assuming the audience isn't a random mixed crowd, some effort should be made ahead of time to educate them about and prepare them for the purpose of the performance, so they will be able to assist from their place. All right, second point. The divine and the human are one. In dramatic ritual, the operator or operators are most often working with what I'm going to call lofty abstracts. The rites of Eleusis, as originally written, are a good example of the ubiquity of such abstracts in dramatic ritual works. As such, they don't easily lend themselves to dramatic interpretation. The roles thus present as being carved into marble. Their interactions very akin to those of chess pieces. In solitary operations, or perhaps non-dramatic operations that only involve one or two others, this may be perfectly acceptable. In such an environment, it is not explicitly necessary to bring such lofty abstracts down to earth, as long as one is reasonably certain that they have a correct, or at least thoroughly conditioned interpretation of whichever abstracts they're handling. In other words, if everybody can agree what they're dealing with in the ritual space, and everybody has a ready understanding of what those things are, then they can portray them however they like. Theatrical ritual departs from this, though, as it relies on dramatic expression of such lofty abstracts in an emotionally charged environment where the interactions between the energies expressed are, although epically so, nonetheless humanized. And in fact, that Homer, I think, had a really good grasp of this. The Iliad and the Odyssey are full of lofty abstracts, but they're also full of very human characters having very human interactions with each other. In such an environment, they cannot be effectively expressed on carved marble tablets. The officiants must use their voices, their bodies, and the skillful expression of emotional energies between each other to manifest the necessary trances. In order to effect this, officiants in a theatrical ritual operation must approach their parts from the attitude that the divine and the human are one. Every lofty abstract that we encounter in philosophy, occultism, or elsewhere is cognate with and actually emergent from some deep aspect of what it means to be human. Crucial to successfully connecting with and expressing one's part in a dramatic ritual operation is to gain a deeply personal understanding of one's human connection to whatever abstraction one is being employed to exemplify. One must be an actor to some extent, but more importantly, one must be skillful in using one's own humanity as a conduit for divine qualities. So finally, how do we all end up on the same page? How do we use the energy and focus that we've generated and our performance to bring us all into an amplified, unified state. This is the general purpose of dramatic ritual. In other words, how do we all end up on the same page? The Gnostic Mass is a great example of how this is managed. And if we're judging them only by their scripts, other rituals do a better or worse job. Of course, there's no objective way to immediately measure success on this point after only one performance, but in a community that regularly performs well-coordinated dramatic ritual together for a well-coordinated set of shared purposes, theoretically the cumulative effect should be measurable over time. Indeed, the Gnostic Mass stands as a great example of this largely because it is regularly performed. So I've made another disclosure caveat at this same point in the online version of this essay, but for this version I'll say this. The majority of my own success in this set of theoretical ideas mostly did not come from within the temple. That is where I began to get these ideas and imagine how they could be put into practice. But the bulk of my real success came from watching and facilitating the process of others in learning a new language. The extent to which the language they were learning from me was tied to my culture, and how in teaching them my language I was unavoidably indoctrinating them into my culture, gave me what I believed to be the most important insights into the group ritual work I had done before. So group dramatic rituals compared to other kinds of ritual are without a doubt the most complex and probably the most difficult to bring to the desired outcome. Not only is one dealing with audiences of various sizes and orientations and complex interplay between the main officiants, but the flow of the ritual itself is often circuitous and not immediately intuitive to one who may be approaching it for the first time. Solitary rituals, by contrast, are usually very simple. One is usually dealing with only one lofty abstract, or at least a very simple general intent, as in a banishing. The concentration of the operator is focused on only one object, and the momentum of the ritual builds linearly toward the culmination and climax of identification with only one object. Dramatic ritual, as a rule, doesn't unfold quite so simply. While dramatic works such as Crowley's Rites of Eleusis have a predictable outcome that is repeated throughout the cycle, one still must be sufficiently familiar with the aspects being exemplified in the rituals to follow their progress and understand where one is in the midst of it all. For the operators, schooled and rehearsed by performance time and what all involved agree the ritual is supposed to be about, this may not require much effort beyond discussing throughout the rehearsal schedule what's happening in the script and practicing during rehearsal how best to express it. This may not, and practice. They will have had weeks and possibly months to come to agreement about what is happening, which by that time should be fairly studied and informed. For the audience, it may not be so simple, and unless they are provided with study materials ahead of the performance, they will be relying entirely on the performance to make sense of what, for most first readers of the script, would go entirely over one's head. So the question we still have to consider here then is, how do we all end up on the same page? Experience leads me to suspect that an important consideration on this point is that the composition of the audience is crucial. As we've already observed with regard to the Gnostic Mass, regular performance within an established community yields superior results. The officers, as well as the congregants, being thoroughly familiar with the material and presumably unified in their purpose for attendance, as well as attuned over time to the collective tone of the group, have very little to distract them from the goal. In contrast, even well-studied first-time Gnostic Mass attendees, when asked what they think of what they just experienced, can only affirm vague positive feelings or feeling vaguely energized. A similar or even lesser effect is probably to be expected from first-time attendees of the rites of Ouroboros. But there are ways to mitigate this. While they may not be attending rehearsals, which can be chaotic enough without having uninvolved people hanging around, they can still educate themselves about what they are planning to attend. If group dramatic workings are given the same kind of serious consideration as individual workings, it seems it would be a given that the audience should be at least half as prepared as the operators to contribute to the energy being raised, the sequences of trances being generated among all present, and the final trance necessary for a successful conclusion of the ritual, or, as in the case of the Ouroboros cycle, an annual course of rituals. On a closing note, I would like to acknowledge that much has been said in this little essay of trances, of group trances even. Within a thelemic context of do what thou wilt, this may seem strange or possibly unduly cultish to an outside observer, or to one making their initial approach to thelema. If it were the case that people were having such trances forced on them without informed consent, that would certainly, or at least should be, strange within a thelemic context. It would certainly be unduly cultish, and in my opinion would constitute an assault on another's will. In order to avoid a group operation being any of those things, I think it's important for audiences of such rituals to have as much of an idea as the operators as to what it's all about, and to be as enthusiastic as the operators in collectively and cooperatively bringing forth these group trances, so crucial to the ritual's success. In such an endeavor, unwilling and unwitting participants anywhere in the temple would be nothing but a hindrance, and under ideal conditions should never be admitted. All right, so that's the introduction. This is a subject that, as I said earlier, when I was in the OTO from, about 1998 to 2005, the majority of the extracurricular work that I did was in dramatic ritual. A lot of it was associated with the OTO. Actually, some of it I did with JP and Johnny. And a lot of these we did for the public. And a lot of these we also did just in a semi-public, as a semi-public function, but mainly just with people who were already tuned into the current that we had going on at the lodge at the time. And I think in contrast, those instances were the best instances because they involved people who were not only familiar with the material, but who were also enthusiastic about the material and who wanted to further develop the community, which, as I've come to conclude from my experience, building communities is the primary function and advantage of the ritual. All right.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.